So first of all, I want to thank my wife's sister and her husband, Maria and Bill, for the use of their lights. Um, they had some lights spare that they didn't need to use, and so I decided to put them to use. And we've got some pro lights here to film, so hopefully it makes viewing a little bit better, and it comes out pretty good. So thanks to those guys for that. And this video is basically about framing. I'm not going to go into crazy detail. There's so much information out there. Really awesome books as well. Definitely recommend. I'll flash the book title up on the screen here so you can see which book I used to frame with. I got it out of the library and it was a huge help. So definitely recommend checking out books. More so than videos on YouTube, but there are some really awesome resources as well, and I'll put some links below the video here for you guys to check out. But in brief, the way I built the walls, framing was actually really easy. It was a fun part. The roof, the ceiling wasn't, the rafters and whatnot was not as easy, but the walls themselves were super easy. And it was a lot of fun, and you can get it done in just a few days if your plans are good. So yeah, simple rules. There's two ways to build with the framing. You'll hear a lot of on center. These are the studs. They sit on a certain measurement away from each other, and that is either 16 inches or 24. So you can choose which way you want to go. 16 is obviously more secure. A lot of insulation is already cut to that measurement to fit in between the studs. 24 is going to save you weight, but it's not going to be as sturdy. So you have to make the decision on which way to go. I went 16 on center, and you can put more in or less, but in order for sheathing to fit, so your plywood on the outside, they're cut to specific measurements so that they'll fit and they'll fall dead on the center of every stud. So if your studs are not perfectly set up on the sole plate and top plate, then you're going to have a problem when it comes to like putting your sheathing on. And the same with if whatever you're using on the inside as well. So if you're going to use tongue and groove pine and you've got a certain length, they come in specific measurements that fit on either 24 or 16 inch on center. So bear that in mind. Be as accurate as you possibly can when you're marking out your plates for your studs. So if you've never looked at a tape measure before, every so often there's one measurement that stands out. So you've got 16, it's bright red, I don't know if you can see that, and then the next one along, 32, is bright red, and they're there because that's the easy way to mark out your studs when you're measuring them out. So for instance, this side of this stud here is exactly 16 to this side of this stud here, and that makes life easier when you're buying insulation, when you're putting up the stuff. And as I've said, so the more perfect you have this, the easier it will be later down the road. Same for roofing materials as well. Make sure the studs are set up properly for your roof. If you're going to put in a skylight, you'll need 24 on center. Just depends on what kind of skylight you're going for, but you'll want 24 on center for where your skylight's going to be. So that's 22.5 inches in between the studs to fit the skylight. So a lot of things to just bear in mind when you're designing. Don't just throw studs up randomly. Get it all into place properly. So let's just look at the very basics of how the framing goes together, what's necessary. The first thing on the very bottom is what's called a sill plate, sole plate, base plate, whatever you want to call it, but it's the bottom piece of 2x4 laid on its side. Then you have the main stud that goes up, and then you might encounter a sill, and then jack studs, and I forget the name of them, it's been so long. I think the king stud is the one that reaches right up to the very top, and then you have two top plates. So you can see two top plates. Now, sometimes the top plates, they basically overlap in the corner. Let's have a look if we can see here. So one of them goes over the top of the other in the corner so that they lock into each other. Also, you might find an area where just here you can see the first top plate has a join, and the one above it cannot have a join in within 2 feet of the one below. So that those joins where they join together, you can't have another join in the top plate above. I've also used to secure the studs. I've put a bunch of these in all over to add a bit more strength, and they're the same up to attach the rafters. I've also used some strapping that goes over the very top of the rafters, so it comes up the rafter over the very top of the ridge beam and down the other rafter there. Okay, so above a window you have a header. The distance span dictates what thickness this header should be, whether it's a 2x4 is enough, or a 2x6 required, or 2x8. So above the wheel wells I put a header as well, but it's a 2x6 because it's a longer distance. So there's a 2x6. Now a header is basically made up of two 2x4s or 2x6s, whichever you use, with a piece of plywood cut to the same size in between those two. They're glued and nailed together. And that creates a header. It adds a bit of strength when there's a bit of distance to cover. Now because this header it's not right up against the top plate, you need some extra studs to carry that through, which match up with the studs below. They're basically every 16 inches, like I said. The header has support from studs just underneath at the very end. They go right down to the bottom. And they're also, because this is not at the top plate, there's another section carrying that up. So that really supports the weight of the header. Then there's another stud to the outside of that header, which runs the whole length. They're called king studs. It goes to the top plate to the very bottom. And then just underneath, some construction would take this all the way down to the very bottom to add extra support for the sill. Run that right to the very bottom for some solid support, but in this tiny house, don't think it's necessary. I had a framer help me out and said that just throwing in this extra bit of support should be fine. So I've just put little blocks in here instead of the full length all the way down. That'll save a bit of weight as well. So I wanted to mention the double top plate here as well and talk about what happens after that. So some people don't use a double top plate to save weight, but I wanted to for stability. So there's 2 top plates. It allows you to overlap on the corners, as I've mentioned. And what happens above here, I just wanted to touch on that. So on top of these 2 top plates, there is another stud turned sideways on its end on the outside face of the wall. And then this is what is the sill plate for the rest of the roof. So the rafters rest on this one. I then filled this side up. Basically, this leaves a channel. So imagine these are the 2x4s. I'll explain. So you've got your top plate and then the side plate, and you can kind of see that's what you have in the, let's see if we can see that. So it's kind of like this. Oh, there we go. It's kind of like that. It leaves a bit of a channel, which some people have run wires down, but I wanted to make it a little bit more secure. So I ended up putting blocking in here as well, and occasionally thickening it out with some ply in the middle because it doesn't quite make it. So yeah, I put that piece on top, and that's kind of how it is inside. So I found it was a bit more secure. I felt it was a bit more stable to fill it with blocking as well. Okay, so when you're framing the wall, make sure you refer to that book that I mentioned. It's a real help. And yes, the method I used was I'd lay everything out on the floor of the trailer for the first wall. And the first wall was, in fact, this wall. I made the easiest one first and the smallest. And so you lay it down on the trailer, sort of lay everything out, make sure everything fits before you nail or screw it together. These are nailed and screwed. I used mainly nails in the first wall, but as I went I decided to add a few screws as well, just to pull it nice and tight together. So you lay it all out, make sure it all works, and then you start nailing it in. Once the wall is constructed, then I placed the plywood on the sheathing whilst it was still laying down, covered it over, making sure that there's a little bit of an overhang, because the sheathing has to overlap the side of the trailer so that if any water gets into the sheathing, it goes outside of the trailer frame. So if you have the sheathing not overlapping the side of the trailer, then you're going to have some issues. So I needed to make sure that the sheathing did overlap the bottom plate. It came down by about, I believe about 6 inches. But you just have to figure that out for your trailer, how much overhang you want, a couple inches, 3 inches, whatever that is. Obviously it's got to take in the floor as well. So that's why I believe it was 6 inches, because you've got that depth of the floor that the sheathing needs to overhang, depending on whether you put the floor inside your trailer framing or on top of your trailer framing. But yes, remember the overhang for the sheathing so that when you do lift your wall up, it's overhanging. Don't forget that one. And then once it's ready to go, I just had somebody stand on the outside of the wall to push it in against it, and I just lifted it up from the inside. I could do this small wall no problem on my own. The bigger walls, we actually needed, there was 3 of us that lifted the big walls, and then the important part of that is squaring everything. And that's one other thing. Before you lift the first wall, you need to square it. So you need to measure the diagonals to make sure it's completely square before you put your plywood on. Basically, you measure from the top corner to the bottom right corner, diagonally across, and then you measure the other diagonal, and they need to be pretty much exact. What you do is you nail down the base plate, so the wall's laying down, you nail it down so that it won't move, and then you measure the top corner, measure the bottom corner, and just knock the top left or right, depending on which way you need to go to make the measurements the same. Knock it in and make it the same. Once it's as close as you possibly can get it, pretty much to the millimeter or to the 1/8 of an inch, or 1/16 of an inch, then you lay on the ply and just secure it in. I also used glue between the ply and the studs just for extra stability, and it's not something that everybody does, but I did. And yeah, then you know that the wall is square, it's not leaning this way or this way, and it's not warped in any way. So make sure you square the wall before you lift it. Then when the second wall comes up, you need to square those together. So a lot of this is in the book that I recommend. Dig it out at the library and you should be good to go. What else have we got? That's probably it, really. Rafters, height of the roof is kind of complicated. I'm not even going to get into that with you guys. You can figure that out for yourselves. Lots of formulas online for the pitch of the roof and whatnot. Do recommend going for a 3-in-1 or steeper. Any shallower, it gets a little complicated with code for coverage and whatnot. So also to consider would be the venting of the rafters. Because of the nature of a tiny house, there's not much space in the rafters for venting. You're supposed to vent between the insulation and the plywood on top of the roof. And what usually happens is you have little baffles. So you have the stud, and then you create a gap between the sheathing and the insulation, which goes out to the eaves, and air can come in on top of the insulation and out the roof in a little ridge vent. But if you're using, if you're going to use 2x6s in the roof, then that will give you that space. You can get away with putting that in. If you're going to use 2x4s, you're going to reduce the amount of space you have to put in a baffle and that air. Something you really need to consider and spend some time over. It all depends on what insulation you're going to use and what kind of venting system you're going to put in. I decided to do like it's called on top sheathing vent. So I use 2x4s, and I don't have any venting above the insulation on the inside of the ply. I use rigid foam in the ceiling, which has a built-in vapor barrier, and I've just stuffed that full. But then on top of the sheathing, there's a gap between the metal roofing and the sheathing, and that is vented at the sides. So I'm hoping that the air circulation on top of the sheathing is going to be enough to keep that vented. We'll see, hopefully. I mean, I have a fire stove in here, a wood-burning stove, so that should keep everything pretty dry. But we'll see. It was a gamble between using 2x6s and for increasing the weight of the house versus how much insulation you want in the rafters. So like I said, it depends on what kind of insulation you're using, whether you're using a vapor barrier and whatnot, but a lot of thought, a lot of research goes into it. You figure yours out, and you know, it's only you to blame for what happens in your house and how it all works out. So lots of considerations. Remember your 1624 on center, get that book, plan it all out, and have fun. The framing was actually the funnest part of the build. Framing and electricity for me. There's still a few things left to come. So anyway, that's it from me for framing. There's so much in the subject I can't cover in this one video. Gable ends is one other thing, up in the rafters. So many different things, but there's so much out there. I just wanted to document how I did mine. And that's it. Cool. Have fun.